Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Brian Hare. He's professor of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. He researches the evolution of cognition by studying both humans, our close relatives, the primates, especially bonobos and chimpanzees, and species whose cognition converged with our own, primarily domestic dogs. He founded and co-directs the Duke Canine Cognition Center and is the author of several books, and today we're going to talk about his most recent one, Survival of the Friendliest, Understanding Our Origins and Rediscovering Our Common Humanity. So Dr. Hare, thank you for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, Ricardo, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be with the Dissenters. What a cool title for a show.
Yeah, yeah. Well, perhaps someday I will explain why I picked that name, but anyway. Okay, so survival of the friendliest. This derives from another very famous phrase that is survival of the fittest, right?
That's right. So normally, when you think of biology, you think of an evolution, you think of survival of the fittest, and that phrase, unfortunately, in the public mind, often gets misconstrued to mean the biggest, the meanest, the strongest, the alpha. And so we titled our book "Survival of the Friendliest" because the truth is that if you take a step back and you say, okay, in life, who is it? What organism or set of organisms have had the most success? And really, it's a species or classes of organisms that have a new way to be friendly that allows them to cooperate in a new way that survive. So we think survival of the fittest is really been misunderstood so badly because fitness just means how many offspring you have. We thought a play on that survival of the friendliest, given the success of friendliness in life, would be a really fun title.
Yeah. And so there are many cognitive tools that we have at our disposal to be able to be friendly in this case. Let's start with shared intentionality. This comes from the work of people like Mike Tomasello and others, right?
hmm Yeah, so one of the things that when we look at animals, and animals have actually been very helpful in trying to teach us what it is to be human, because one of the underlying assumptions of all the work I do, and Mike Tomasello as well, is if you want to know what it is to be human, well, you have to first know what it is to be not human. And one of the things we've learned by studying bonobos and chimpanzees is they're amazing at cooperating, they're amazing at communicating, but what they struggle with is to kind of put those two things together, to communicate in order to cooperate. And I think Mike in particular has pushed the idea that really humans can think about other humans in a way that even chimpanzees and bonobos or other rich cognitive animals can't, in that I can imagine that my goal and your goal today is a shared goal. We both want to communicate interesting science to our crowd today, and so we're going to play off of each other to make sure that happens. And so I can imagine your goal, you can imagine mine, but we also know we have the same goal. And so that kind of shared intentionality seems to be special about humans and allows us to cooperate and communicate in ways that other animals can't.
But do bonobos or chimpanzees have intentionality in any way, even if it's not shared? I mean, when they perform a certain behavior or action, do they have an intention to behind it or something like that?
Yeah, so I think most people who study animal behavior, especially who take a cognitive perspective, would have no problem saying that animals are intentional. So intentional would be you act in a way where if you have a goal and it is somehow perturbed, or your goal has a detour or a problem in obtaining your goal, that you would take another plan, you take another route to try to accomplish that goal. That would be enough to then say, okay, that animal has an intention, it has a goal in mind. But what I'm saying is even a next step forward, which is chimpanzees, bonobos, and many animals, actually, we have evidence that not only do they have goals themselves, but they recognize others as having goals, and that they are sensitive, that we have evidence that other animals like bonobos and chimps are sensitive, that when you have a goal, it's different from their goal, and they can pick that up. They understand. It's not just that animals are intentional, but they even know you're intentional.
Yeah. Since you study dog cognition, I mean, what are the parallels that we can establish between the cognition exhibited by dogs and us and humans?
Well, it seems crazy because dogs are so distantly related from us to think that in any way dogs have evolved to be more human-like. But again, if you take a big step back and just think about dog evolution from wolves, there's really nice genetic work showing that dogs have evolved physical or their bodies have adapted in ways that are human-like. So we know that dogs have the ability to digest starch, and the same genes that have evolved in humans to allow us to digest starch have evolved during dog evolution. We know that they have some of the same genetic changes that allow for malaria defense in West Africa. West African dogs have some of the same genetic changes. Same genetic changes that allow for that prevent hypoxia in populations in the Himalayas living at very high altitude. The genetic changes that allow humans to live at high altitude have happened in Himalayan dogs. So there's many examples where dogs have become human-like, and so we think dogs have become cognitively more human-like in that they can do this cooperative communication that we were just talking about that is so hard for chimpanzees and bonobos. They can do it in a limited way, but very much like how small kids 9 to 12 months old, as they begin to learn language and participate in culture, dogs start understanding gestural communication. And it's sort of the beginning of our understanding of others as intentional. Dogs are doing kind of the same thing.
Mhm. So dogs understand pointing, but other primates beside us don't, right?
Yeah, and it's not just they understand pointing. They really understand gestural communication in a really rich way, in the way that young children, 9 to 12, um, uh, uh, 9 to 12 months of age do. So they do understand a pointing gesture, but they also understand if they're searching for something, if you turn your head and you're trying to communicate to them. They also understand your voice direction. They can use your voice as if it was a pointing gesture, and they do this all without any training. They just are prepared. To understand us in a way that chimpanzees and bonobos on these same kind of tasks that we use to assess this are really struggle with.
Mhm. And in the book, you talk also about dog cognition because dogs have been domesticated by us, or wolves have been domesticated into dogs by us, let's say. This process of domestication is important to understand why species that are friendlier, like us, have evolved, right?
Yeah, so that's another question. So far we've been talking sort of about what is it psychologically that might be different between humans and animals. But the second question, and it's the question that I find the most challenging and exciting and delightful question. It's a more biological question. Okay, once we identify what it is to be human, how did it happen? What made us this way? What was the evolutionary process? What drove it? Was it natural selection? Was it an emergent property of something else? Was it random? Or was it something that we don't even understand yet? So in the book, we take the view that if we look at how cooperative communicative abilities evolved in dogs, it actually gives us insight into ourselves. And the process by which our cooperative communicative abilities, like shared intentionality, may have been shaped and evolved. And so the argument is based on experimental evidence of how dogs became domesticated and also ethological inference, I guess, we think that dogs evolved not by humans deciding one day to create dogs, but instead through natural selection and selection for friendliness, friendly behavior towards humans, and an attraction towards humans and their artifacts, that where fear was replaced with interest and a need to interact and socialize with us. And as that happened, all sorts of other changes happened by accident. And so we think that's what drove dog evolution. And we think a parallel process where humans were actually late in human evolution were selected for friendliness, and it's what gave our species an advantage over all the other human species that we were living with 50,000 years ago.
But in the case of dogs, we are talking about humans domesticating dogs. But in the case of humans, this has been a process of self-domestication.
That's right. And well, actually, so in the case of dogs, it is self-domestication in that the thinking is that the wolves chose us. We didn't choose them. Basically, wolves wouldn't go away. And as humans became super predators and started creating a lot of waste, uh, it became impossible for wild wolves to resist sneaking in at nighttime and being attracted to all the resources we were creating. And that could be anything from waste from a hunt or food, but also could be human feces. It ends up that human feces is highly nutritious from a carnivore or canid perspective. So you can imagine raiding a latrine every night. You know where it is. It doesn't fight back. It's really rich. It's just, from a human perspective and a cultural perspective, it's pretty gross. But it's a wonderful resource if you're a wolf and you have that instead of having to get kicked in the face or maybe not being successful hunting. So the idea is the wolves chose us. And that natural selection selected wolves that were able to take advantage of those resources. Now, it is an interaction with humans, an interspecific interaction that led the selection for friendliness. There are other examples of that. Cleaner wrasse, for instance, as they were interacting with predatory fish, cleaner wrasse that were attracted to predators were selected to be friendly towards them and had access to a new food resource. So I think there are other examples of that, but then your question is, yeah, but what about humans? Because humans were not, the selection pressure isn't an interspecific selection pressure. So what was it, I guess, is your question, right?
Yes, yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
So this is where thinking about bonobos and chimpanzees and particularly bonobo evolution is very helpful because we think in the case of bonobos evolving from chimpanzees that bonobos have a lot of traits that are very similar to when you compare chimps to bonobos. It looks a lot like when you compare wolf to dog. So wolves and chimpanzees are sort of the analog of one another, and dogs and bonobos are the analog of one another. And when you do that, and you think about what the selection pressure would be, it was within species that would have led selection for friendliness for bonobos to become self-domesticated, which we've suggested. Richard Wrangham and I have argued for. And it's females actually having the power, the social power, to select against aggressive males and select for the friendliest males. So we think something similar happened in human evolution. Perhaps it was sexual selection. I actually think it was selection that happened in intergroup interactions. Richard Wrangham has argued that it was within group that the selection for friendliness occurred. So I can lay out that for you, how I think the intergroup selection happened for humans if you want.
Yes, if you could tell us a little bit about that, and is it group selection or a form of group selection or not?
Yeah, so my idea is that looking at interspecific interactions with between bonobos and chimpanzees, what we know is that chimpanzees are xenophobic. They're very fearful of strangers. Bonobos are xenophilic. They're attracted to strangers. They have this completely different response to strangers, but both species are, both who are our first cousins in the primate world. So they're both equally related to us. It's like having two cousins. One's a girl, one's a boy. They're different from each other, but they're both your first cousin. That's how it works with bonobos and chimps. So both of those species have this strong response to strangers. One is a very positive response in bonobos, one is negative in chimpanzees. But what we know is that both of those responses are based on one criteria, which is just are you familiar? Am I familiar with this individual I'm responding to? Or am I unfamiliar? If I'm unfamiliar, if I'm a bonobo, I have a positive response. If I'm unfamiliar as a chimpanzee, I have a fearful response. In humans, the argument is that actually we have a new social category that evolved, and it changes everything about our group dynamics. And that new social category, not unlike the idea of group intentionality, we have a group idea of identity, of who we are. That I'm no longer just Brian, and I know these people who are familiar to me, and then these people are unfamiliar, and I have a strong response. our social world goes far beyond that, because then it becomes Brian, who's a professor at Duke University. I'm in this group that has this identity, or I'm Brian, who's an American, or I'm Brian, who's a scientist. And so we have these identities. And so when I meet Ricardo from halfway across the world, and he's really interested in these topics and science, well, we instantly have an identity. We become friends. We never met before right now. So the idea that we have these markers of identity that allow us to instantly form fast friendships is completely unique to our species. It allows us to expand our social world. We start caring about other individuals who have those group markers as if they're family. We can learn from each other. We can cooperate in ways that other species can't. And we, I think, outcompeted all the other humans, because I guess the most controversial part of this is I really think that other human species, including Neanderthals, did not have social identity.
So we form these group identities that can expand, but at the same time our empathy doesn't work to the same extent to people that are closer to us in comparison with people that are not part of our more close group, right?
Say that again. So you're saying,
But basically, what I'm trying to ask is if our empathy really works the same for all people that are part of our in group.
okay. So yeah, relative to say a chimpanzee or bonobo group, I would argue that yes, obviously humans are still driven by kin bonds and kinship. I'm not suggesting that that goes away. I'm just suggesting that relative to other primate species, we see our in-group more like family. We have a response to them more like their family and have more empathy towards them than other human species or other primates would be able to. And that's what then allows, and especially complete strangers who have just met, can work together and feel and be compassionate for each other. A short 5-minute interaction, and you could get massive amounts of empathy and compassion among strange humans, as long as there's some marker of identity that makes them feel like they're from the same group. That's unbelievable. But there's a flip side to that as well, and Paul Bloom has talked about sort of these empathy being like a spotlight where it gets more focused on certain individuals. And I think what happens is when your own in-group is threatened, you feel like your own in-group is threatened, and you have this concern for them, that whatever that in-group is, that then you have the ability to kind of turn off your compassion, focus your empathy towards your own group, and exclude morally other groups.
And are we able to expand our empathy to include people from groups that are considered out groups or not?
Well, yes, we can absolutely, because every human has sort of multiple layers of group identity, and so as long as that out group can, oh, I didn't know that out group actually is in our group. They share this shared identity that I didn't know, and so now all of a sudden a group that I thought was an out group is an in group. And so that would then allow for a level of concern that you might see towards an in-group. The other one is just an out-group that's not threatening my own group. They're just sort of neutral, and I don't feel threatened by them. That would be a group that you could feel, a lot of empathy. I think the problem becomes if there's the perception that an out-group is threatening you, and particularly if your other group members feel like and are being told that the other group is dehumanizing you. If you feel like the threatening group, it's not just threatening in any random way, it's threatening you by not seeing you and your group members as fully human. That threat is the one that really shuts down human compassion and empathy towards other groups.
Yeah. So one psychological ingredient that we haven't still talked about is self-control, and in the book you also mention that and talk about, for example, the Marshmallow Test. So
Right, sure.
What is that test about, and what can we learn from it?
So the test originated from work by Walter Mischel, and it was done decades ago. But it's been subsequently replicated in humans, and also I've done a lot of work with animals, trying to design different types of marshmallow tests for animals. And I think we can learn a lot. One is in humans, it ends up that self-control is incredibly important. The marshmallow test is basically you're given the option of eating something now or waiting and to get more. And the individual variability among humans for how long you're able to wait is related to performance on all sorts of other measures later in life. And so there have been arguments about exactly how powerful those things are linked, but there's still nice evidence that how you perform as a small child on this is related to what you do much later in life. In terms of all sorts of measures that might be important, whether it's grades or your salary or where you end up in terms of your life satisfaction. So it seems like self-control is really important, and it's sort of the pause between thought and action, where you have this thought of here's what I have to do, and instead of just doing it, you pause and sort of mull over maybe different alternatives. And so you can see why that would be really important. It's sort of the ability that keeps at a family dinner, if you've got a lot of self-control, you manage to not have a fist fight with your siblings or whatever. So in animals, what we found though is that self-control and the marshmallow type test we've designed for animals, that this type of pause before action and the ability to have a pause is related to brain size. So the larger an animal's brain is, the more capable they are at quickly showing a high level of self-control. Well, that tells us a lot about ourselves all of a sudden, because the defining trait in the evolution of our genus, all human species that evolved, they all had big brains. And so that helps us understand the psychology of all those humans, which is they would have enormous amounts of self-control relative to chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees and bonobos have human-like self-control levels until a human gets to be about 6 years old. When we've done direct comparisons, they start to kind of fall apart when you're around 6. They can't keep up anymore. So finally, a 6-year-old has more self-control than a chimp or a bonobo. And so the argument is that other human species would have had a lot of self-control. Neanderthals would have had a lot of self-control. Homo erectus would have had a lot of self-control. And that would have led them to be more flexible in terms of planning between different actions.
Mm-hmm. And do we get to know that simply by studying the brain size, or is it that there are certain specific areas of the brain that get bigger with evolution, and those are the ones that explain self-control, like, for example, the frontal cortex?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work within neuroscience trying to understand exactly what are the regions that are involved in human self-control. And I think within humans, studies have implicated medial prefrontal cortex and regions of the frontal cortex as well. Other a network of regions, let's put it that way. But it's all cortex, and it's all tends to be frontal cortex, and it develops late into life until you're 22. You're still having synaptic pruning that it increases your efficiency of your brain, and self-control seems to be one of those things that still is being fine-tuned late in life. So yes, absolutely, there's work on that, but on different regions that may be implicated. But across different species, you get a slightly different story just looking at brain size, and that's because frontal cortex tends to scale with brain size, and so you can use brain size as a proxy for regions of the brain that may be specifically implicated in allowing for self-control, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what is the role that hormones like oxytocin play? Because it seems that they don't work the same for all people. When we are talking about our in-groups, oxytocin makes us friendlier, but when we are talking about out-groups, perhaps we become more hostile, right?
Yeah, so I think oxytocin as a hormone has an amazing PR firm. And a lot of people have, talked about it being the love hormone, or, whatever. I've heard it the hug hormone, all this kind of stuff. There's no doubting that it is implicated in social bonding in non-human animals. And there's related work in humans. The controversy came because, and there is controversy surrounding the work on oxytocin in humans in particular. The controversy came because it was sort of a lot of people, because it's involved in social bonding, it sort of was the good hormone. It became, it's involved in nice behaviors. But the origin of oxytocin is to encourage maternal behavior. And maternal behavior includes nurturing behavior, bonding and caring and concern for offspring that, obviously is the stuff that we goo goo and gaga about and is so beautiful. But mothers don't just care for their offspring by being kind to them, they also protect them and defend them. And so, at the same time that increases in oxytocin lead to social bonding and nurturing behavior, they also lead to maternal aggression. And also if it's a species where you have parental care from both mother and father, it leads to aggression from both. So it's a system that allows for you to care for those who you are your offspring, or your group that matters to you, to be fit and have fitness. And so what the argument is in humans, in the case in the book we make in Survival the Friendliest, is that that same hormone has been sort of that sort of paradox of oxytocin leading to kindness but also leading to aggression has now been mapped onto this new social identity. So as we care about our group more like their family members, our oxytocin system allows us to be compassionate and to socially bond in a way we would with friends as if they were family members. But at the same time, when they're threatened, we're going to defend them as if they're family members, and especially if we feel threatened by outgroups that are dehumanizing us. So I think oxytocin is implicated, and if there's selection for friendliness in humans, as we become friendly towards these new categories, these new social identities, I think oxytocin is implicated, and the relationship between serotonin and oxytocin and its expression, I think, are a nice tie-in between selection for friendliness, because we know in animals the first thing that happens is you have an increase in serotonin, and the serotonergic system is overhauled in domestication, I guess is a short way to say it. And oxytocin then would be heavily affected by that.
Mhm. So another psychological mechanism that is important here is theory of mind. So could you tell us what theory of mind is about and if other animals also have it or not?
Yeah, so when we were talking about shared intentionality, me understanding that you and I have the same goal to communicate, and I can imagine what your goal is, and you can imagine, oh, we have the same goal. Thinking about the thoughts of others is theory of mind. It's the idea that I know you have thoughts and beliefs, and you have goals, and you have perceptions, you see things, hear things, and they're not always the same as my own. You may hear or see things or think things or believe things or have feelings that I don't have. All of that is our theory of other people's minds. And so I've worked with lots of people, and the field of animal cognition has made a lot of progress demonstrating that animals do have the ability in some cases to think about the thoughts of others. There are limitations to those abilities, and humans by far are the most flexible. But it's not that our abilities arose de novo out of nowhere. It seems that other great apes, chimpanzees and bonobos, share some of those abilities with us. And you can imagine in our evolution that we, as humans, evolved, those abilities were selected or enhanced. So I think it's related to that intergroup interaction, because when I'm saying to you that we feel threatened and our friendliness turns off, well, that's the friendliness I'm talking about. I'm talking about theory of mind. I'm saying that our in-group kindness and our empathy, our ability to imagine what it's like to be someone else and how they're feeling, that's theory of mind. Empathy is driven by theory of mind. And it's our theory of mind and our social network that allows for theory of mind that when we feel our group is threatened, shuts off towards others. And we no longer see them as having to receive our moral consideration. We don't have to treat them morally because they're not even fully human.
So there's reduced activity in our theory of mind network when we are dealing with outsiders, with people from outgroups.
That would be the prediction. and there is just a few, tests of that so far, and I would say that there's tentative evidence in favor of it. But certainly, I think in this book we make a bunch of proposals for the future, not just things that we know for sure, or I feel really confident, that we know that that's definitely how it works. I think there are things that we're saying, we're predicting. That's what we should see.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we get into that, in the book, we've already mentioned self-domestication and domestication of dogs, but you also talk about simianization. What is
Mm.
that about?
Yeah, Simianization is a pernicious form of dehumanization. So, dehumanization, to back up for a second, is when you ask people, to sort of think about another group, different group identities, and you ask them, people in those groups, other than your own group, whether it's another gender, a racial group, an ethnicity, another a country. It doesn't matter, whatever identity. I mean, people who wear long pants or short pants. I don't know. You can ask people anything. People who wear hats, people who don't. And you ask them, are the people in those groups, are they fully human? And you can give them a sort of a scale from 0 to 100. How human are people in those groups? And so shocking number of people don't do what I think you and I would do, which is, I mean, it doesn't matter what group it is, they're fully human. They are biologically as human as I am. But many people do not report that. They report that some of the groups are not fully human. And one of the most pernicious forms of this type of dehumanization is called simianization. It's where basically when you don't see someone as fully human, you see them as more like an animal, or you attribute animal-like psychology to them, or what you think is animal-like psychology to them, and a comparison to different groups, to non-human primates, and in particular, great apes, or people would just say apes. Oh, he's like an ape, or she's like an ape, as an insult, trying to say that you're not fully human. That would be simianization. And, oh, maybe it's just a mean thing to say, and, playground behavior, and it's whatever, get over it, sticks and stones kind of stuff. But it ends up that dehumanization and seeing others as not fully human predicts violence, and it anticipates harm in a way that other measures of human disliking do not. So normal measures of prejudice, for instance, we hear a lot about prejudice. Prejudice is defined as just not liking a group. That's different than not seeing people in that group as human. And so the measure of dehumanization or simianization actually predicts whether people will accept harm towards others, whereas prejudice measures liking, disliking another group. It doesn't. So I think a lot of the things that we worry about in democratic society are going to be explained by this really frightening psychological capability we have to dehumanize and simianize others.
Yeah, and in the book you also talk about the social dominance orientation, and you establish a relationship between it and right-wing authoritarianism. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I was reading the work of Karen Stinner, and Karen Stinner has written about authoritarianism, and sort of the psychology of authoritarianism. And I was introduced to the idea that conservative movements don't tend to be a uniform group. It's usually a combination of different personalities and psychologies. No surprise, it's a big group of people. And she sort of divides it to right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. And right-wing authoritarianism is defined as people who really like conformity. They like people to conform, and they don't like people to not conform. And they're attracted to that kind of conservatism. People who are high in social dominance orientation, those are people who may not be conformists. They may not be interested in conformity. What they're interested in is their group being the top group, that their group is superior to other groups. And so those different psychologies have different motivations politically, but often in these right-wing groups, they sort of are attracted to one another. And so you've got people high in social dominance orientation who want to rule the group, and you've got right-wing authoritarians who want to conform and want other people to conform. And if their superior group has to have other inferior groups conform, then so be it.
Mhm. But there are also left-wing authoritarians, or not?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that was fun to think about as somebody who argues, and we argue in Survival of the Friendliest, that dehumanization, this really frightening psychology, is universal to our species. That every human being, including myself, and in reflecting, I could think of several times where I had clearly dehumanized outgroups that I was threatened by. And I tell a story in the book early in my childhood where I feel like that happened. I think everyone has the brain built for friendliness, and that's what allowed our species to succeed. But our friendliness can shut down when we feel threatened, and all of us are built that way. If that's true, then you have to play out the experiment and say to yourself, okay, well, fine, people who are conformist or people who are hierarchical, when they have extreme ideology, that leads them to dehumanize. But what about the opposite direction politically? And so I started to think about people who have extreme egalitarian traits, where they want everyone to be exactly equal, and anyone who has anything more than anyone else in any way, shape, or form is dehumanized. And so you can have an extreme form of, let's call it communism, and you can also have extreme form of anarchy, where I think conformity is so bad, and I think no one should be the same, and anybody who tries to do anything the same as anybody else is horrible, and I dehumanize them. So I think any of these views of the world could become so extreme that they lead to dehumanization.
Yeah. And okay, so what can we do with all this information? Do you think that in the future it will be possible for us to breed humans that are more friendly or friendlier in this case? I mean, I know that I'm alluding to eugenics here, but do you think that would be possible?
Well, Ricardo, I'm glad you asked me that question, because I get asked that question almost every time I talk about domestication. Because I told you that dogs have been selected for friendliness. I've told you that bonobos have been selected for friendliness. I even told you that humans in human evolution were selected for friendliness through natural selection. And that this increase in friendliness led to an increase in cooperation. Of course, in our case, it leads to the darker side of our psychology. So why not just keep the process going? Well, I think that, as you alluded, it would require a level of eugenics that would be beyond morally repugnant. It would just be absolutely morally awful, because eugenics is the institutional control of reproductive choices in others, and I think that would not be appropriate or acceptable in any shape or form. But let's just talk about the biology. Could it even work? And the answer is no, because what we know is that when the selection was occurring in humans that I'm referring to, there would have been around 1 million, maybe 2 million people in the whole world. Now there's 7 billion. When experiments have done where you select animals to be friendlier, you can only allow 1% of a population to reproduce. So if you're talking about, you take the friendliest 1% and have them breed together, you can't have 1% of humans, only 1% of humans are allowed to reproduce. That's just never going to fly. And then the other thing is, even if for some reason something that horrific occurred, we don't know the genes that allow for friendliness, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, involved in controlling our behavior that is related to friendliness and cooperation. So you wouldn't even know who you would want to have participate. So it just would not work, on top of the fact that it is frighteningly morally repugnant.
Yeah, but that's an important question always to pose, because people might think, okay, so what can we do about dehumanization, about the way we treat people from outgroups and things like that? So let's try to create friendlier people. And okay, so eugenics probably won't work. Let's talk about other approaches, because in the book you also talk about that. And you mentioned several of them. Are there any approaches that have been proven to work when trying to reduce, for example, levels of hostility between people of different groups?
Yeah, so I don't think we sort of say, okay, it's not going to be eugenics. It's not going to be technology on its own. I don't think we can hope, with so many world problems, we're like, oh, yay, clean energy. We just wait for the technology. I don't think that typical trick is going to work. In this case, I think a social problem like this requires social solutions, and I think a combination of liberal democracy and what we call cross-group friendships really are a recipe for a friendlier future. So I think democracy, with all her flaws, has much to go for if we want a friendlier future. But let me move to, as not being a political scientist, let me move to the social science or the social psychological work, which shows that friendships between different groups. So when you have different groups with different identities, and one group or each group feels threatened by the other, and maybe both groups are actively dehumanizing the other group, and that is a recipe for disaster, because that means that both groups are morally excluding the other group and are gearing up to do horrible things to one another. What could possibly diffuse the situation, or how could we immunize ourselves so that we don't end up dehumanizing a group we view as not the same as our own group? And I think the answer that we get over and over, and there's very strong evidence that cross-group friendships, when you have friendships that can act as a bridge between two groups, where real meaningful friendships, not just, oh, I know this guy, he's a colleague, I mean like your close friend is in that other group, and other people know that your close friend is in that group, that both groups then end up having a much harder time dehumanizing one another when these bridges exist. And so I think finding techniques, everything from how we educate our kids to how we build our cities, to encourage cross-group friendship is a way to promise a friendlier future and protect our human rights and our liberal democracies.
So that's what works. But now my last question will be about other approaches that people usually think about, like, for example, teaching tolerance for diversity or priming multiculturalism, because those approaches might backfire, right?
Yes. There's not really good at so cross group friendships, and it's called contact theory. I think there's overwhelming evidence when two groups feel interdependent on each other that their success is necessary for their ability to win or succeed. Oh man, that really then hyperdrives the cross group friendship and the reduction of any ill will. I don't think there's any evidence of the same nature from that I'm talking about for this other mechanism for things like teaching diversity, tolerance. In fact, there's evidence that it can backfire, as you suggest. The other one is, there was a lot of energy and effort, at least in the United States. I don't know about in Europe. It's been a long time since I lived in Europe now, but so I don't know. But there was a big effort to have people have trigger warnings and discussion of microaggression, and the idea was to create safe spaces where people weren't insulted. And while I do not think people should be insulted, I think people should feel safe at work, and I would never disagree that that is the case. The specific techniques of using trigger warnings, there's actually now empirical evidence that it harms people. It doesn't help them. And so I think my main concern is just we need to have an empirical approach. We shouldn't have ideologies. We should have testable ideas. And if we really care about getting along and having a friendly future, let's go out and test our best ideas, and the ones that gain support, let's find ways to implement them. The ones that are falsified, let's let them go. And so I don't have any ideology about this. I just want people to be friendly. If trigger warnings had been demonstrated to powerfully work, I would be really excited about thinking about how to do that in an ethical way. But they haven't. And so I think the best evidence is for these cross-group friendships.
Okay. So Dr. Hare, let's end the interview here. Just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you on the internet?
Sure. I'm on Twitter, Be Hair Dog Guy, and you can look up my website, brianhare.net, and our book is available anywhere books are sold. And actually, it just came out in the UK, so if you go to anywhere,
Amazon.
Amazon, etc., you can find it there. And the UK version though has a cooler cover. It's got a little like Australopithecine carrying a gift. So look for that.
Yeah, okay, so guys, the book is Survival of the Friendliest, Understanding Our Origins and Rediscovering Our Common Humanity. So run and buy it. It's very interesting and it was a great read, by the way, Dr. Hare. And
Thank you.
thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ricardo.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litske and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klimpy, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Belby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is our Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.